The last topic we will cover in the course corresponds to Chapter 20, Hunger and the Global Environment. While we've seen that it's certainly important to select nutritious foods for optimal health, we also need to take a look at what happens if you don't have the resources to select these certain foods. Or what if they're not even an option, as we see in certain communities as well as on a global level? It's one thing to be hungry due to skipping a meal or maybe eating later than usual. It's another thing to be hungry due to the lack of food. Hunger has many causes. Three to note certainly include poverty, population growth, as well as environmental degradation. And we'll take a look at these three a little bit closer. Statistically, what we know is that 1 person in 9 experiences persistent hunger, and millions die of hunger-related causes every year. So how can we provide enough food to meet the needs of the growing population without destroying the natural resources needed to continue producing food? There really are no easy answers, but this study will hopefully allow you to look at some of the simple ways that we may actually be able to have an effect on making our planet sustainable. In the United States, it's estimated that there are about 42 million people living in poverty who are experiencing what's known as food insecurity. Food insecurity has been defined as a major social problem in our country, and you could see that it's defined as limited or uncertain access to foods of sufficient quality or quantity to be able to sustain a healthy and active life. At its most extreme, people experience hunger because they have absolutely no food. More often, they have too little food, which then is defined as food insufficiency. Often people have to make the choice between buying food and other life necessities. For example, do you buy food or do you pay the rent? Do you buy food? Do you pay your utilities? Do you buy food or do you buy your necessary prescription medications? It often can be a very, very difficult choice. And in many cases, it is the food, it's the nutrition aspect that's going to suffer. There are programs that have been developed, again, within the United States at a federal, state, as well as a local level. And you might be familiar with some of these. There's the WIC program, which is focused on women, infant, and children. There's school breakfast and lunch programs. There is the SNAP program, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Meals on Wheels, food banks, as well as pantries and soup kitchens, which have the ability to offer some form of food assistance for some of these populations. In communities, we have seen, ironically, that hunger and obesity can often exist side by side. That hunger actually reflects inadequate food, and usually when we think of obesity, that implies an excessive intake. It seems like there's some type of a paradox involved then, and this is often referred to as the poverty-obesity paradox. What we've seen is that the highest rates of obesity occur among those living in the greatest poverty. These are the very same people who are living with food insecurity. So why does this happen? Well, a couple factors come into play. Healthy choices, unfortunately, are not always available in certain communities, especially the availability of fruits and vegetables, which are nutrient-dense foods. A lot of nutrients in a smaller amount of calories. Then there are certain areas where maybe grocery stores are simply lacking. Think about inner cities where there are more corner stores or convenience stores available. What do they tend to carry? Well, they carry more processed foods, more fast foods. And we know that these are the type of foods that tend to be high in caloric value and low in nutrition. They also tend to be the least expensive. Then another point to note as far as this paradox goes, often if people are unsure if they are going to be even having a next meal. They may actually overeat if there is the question about whether there's going to be food available tomorrow or if there's going to be enough money even available tomorrow. Interesting, what's been found too is that people who are experiencing food insecurity who do not participate in any of the food assistance programs, which I have previously mentioned, they actually tend to have a greater risk of obesity than those who do participate. What this shows is that actually providing food, providing nutritious foods, may actually help prevent obesity. Take a look at this representation of the poverty-obesity paradox. And what you'll see is that poverty and food insecurity can lead to both malnutrition as well as obesity. Poverty can cause both hunger as well as food insecurity. With hunger, there is then the possibility of inadequate nutrition, leading eventually to malnutrition. Poverty also can cause food insecurity, which in one direction, it can also lead to inadequate nutrition and therefore malnutrition, but it can also go the other way, where food insecurity can lead to an excessive intake of foods that are high in calories or energy, foods that are high in fat, high in sugar. And what that then will lead to is the development of obesity. So you can see again how we can have in the same communities hunger and obesity existing side by side. While hunger is an issue in the United States, it is much more widespread in developing countries, where it's estimated that 795 million go hungry. Poverty remains a major underlying factor, especially for the poorest poor, who often own no land or possessions and survive on about $1 a day. Who are these poorest poor? Well, in most cases, they are usually female. Females who are malnourished become mothers who are malnourished, giving birth to babies who are malnourished. And unfortunately, the cycle of hunger, malnutrition, and poverty continues. As the cycle of hunger, poverty, and malnutrition continues, the number of children affected is alarming. 1 in 4 children in the developing world is severely underweight by age 5. As malnutrition worsens, they become more vulnerable to diseases of poverty, with a very high likelihood of early death, often due to diarrhea as well as dehydration. As I mentioned, malnutrition leads to what we categorize as diseases of poverty. So what do these include? They can include parasitic and infectious diseases such as dysentery, cholera, which in turn can cause severe diarrhea, respiratory illnesses such as pneumonia, whooping cough, measles, malaria all fall under this same category. Then acute malnutrition can also present itself in distinctive forms. There is a condition known as kwashiorkor, which is exhibited by severe growth failure, edema, fatty liver, often manifesting itself as an extremely swollen belly. Anemia, apathy, weakness are some of the other symptoms with kwashiorkor. Then marasmus is another acute state of malnutrition where the child also exhibits severe growth failure. There is loss of body fat and muscle to the point where the child appears extremely thin, or often we categorize them as being just skin and bones. Along with those manifestations, there's also the apathy and the weakness that will also occur. Food shortages are certainly a factor in world hunger. These shortages may be caused by famine due to drought, floods, pests. Crops can be limited or they can be completely devastated, majorly affecting the food that's available. There's also economic and political effects which play a role as far as the food supply. Often there might be an increase in food prices coupled with decreases in wages. There can be changes in government policy, which will all affect the food availability. Armed conflicts can also play a role. Often opposing sides in civil wars will use starvation of civilians as a war tactic. And then there's also natural disasters which can come into play. Things like earthquakes, tsunamis, even pandemic outbreaks can all affect the availability of food. So globally, what would be considered the hunger hotspots? Well, if you look at this representation, you could see that the majority of the world's hungry live in what is noted as sub-Saharan Africa, with other areas such as Asia and South America also being notable. As I previously noted, there are federal, state, and local organizations in the United States to help battle hunger and poverty here at home. There are also a multitude of organizations globally who are tackling these same issues. This slide, as well as the following slide, gives you a list of hunger relief organizations that are helping to solve both poverty as well as hunger. So we've established hunger and poverty are major issues. Food shortages may be due to various factors, as we previously have discussed, but there's another factor to also add to the whole equation, and that is the population. The world's increasing population will create a deficit of food and increase poverty. It is expected that food demand will double by the time we hit 2050. With a growing population, we simply need more food. But here's the problem. Food production damages the environment, and this damaged environment cannot adequately support production of enough food. So what we need to be able to do is develop methods which are sustainable. Sustainable meaning that they are able to continue indefinitely with little or no harm to the environment. Before we review some of these sustainability methods, let's take a look though at how food production does actually affect or damage the environment. So we plant crops, corn, wheat, soy, the list can go on and on. The soil that the crops are planted in will lose nutrients as each crop is harvested. So fertilizer then is used. There's nitrogen in the fertilizer, which can then eventually be released as a gas, which can contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. That fertilizer also can leach down into groundwater and kill off some aquatic plants and animals while also depleting them of oxygen. Herbicides and pesticides are also used to protect crops against weeds and pests. However, farm workers can come in contact with some of these herbicides and pesticides, which can have adverse effects for them, and then pesticide residues that end up on the food that we as consumers then eat can also have some adverse effects. Then there's also depletion of the water supply that can occur with planting crops. Excessive irrigation can eventually dry up rivers and lakes. It can lower the water table of specific regions. Raising livestock takes an enormous toll on land and energy resources. Animals produce large amounts of methane, which has been identified as being a major greenhouse gas contributing to climate change. Cattle and pigs in particular produce massive amounts of animal wastes. The ammonia which is present in their wastes also pollutes the air and is a major cause of acid rain. Cropland is used to produce grain for livestock instead of humans. This slide helps us to visualize a comparison between the amount of grain necessary to produce 1 pound of bread versus the amount of grain necessary for an animal to gain 1 pound. Food production also uses an enormous amount of water. The amount of water necessary to produce just 1 slice of bread, 1 pound of corn, 1 pound of hamburger meat is mind-boggling. It's estimated that current farming practices are responsible for 70% of the pollution present in rivers and streams in the United States. If present trends continue, it is thought that by 2025, 50% of the world's population will live in water-stressed regions. So what are the environmental costs from fishing? Well, when fish is caught at a faster rate than at which they can reproduce, the fish population will decrease. Fishing nets and lines also have the potential to kill non-food species who may get caught up in them, and this can affect turtles, seals, dolphins, as well as other types of species. Since catching wild fish can't keep up with human consumption, fish farming or aquaculture has been developed. In these fish farms, there are net cages that enclose fish in bodies of water. Might be the ocean, lakes, ponds, etc. Fish are fed special fish chow, which increases their growth significantly. In addition to these net cages being placed in bodies of water, in certain situations, artificial ponds are actually used. So this fish chow, what is this? Well, fish chow is predominantly made up of grains as well as other fish. The use of grains and fish now will decrease the amount of these two particular foods being available to humans. There are sustainability practices which are being used, which is helping with this whole process. Other ones are also still being studied. Another thing to consider when we're talking about fishing is that it's very energy intensive. It contributes to a great amount of pollution. Then also we need to consider the concept of bioaccumulation, which we reviewed in chapter 19. With bioaccumulation, if you recall, there's the potential for the buildup of toxins within the larger fish themselves. Agricultural methods have advanced greatly to increase overall production. However, we can see that due to the environmental effects of these methods, we need to support sustainability to help with the fight against poverty and hunger. So what roles do nations play? Well, developed nations have the responsibility of putting practices in place to reduce waste and pollution while promoting conservation. Education needs also need to be passed to developing countries, as well as appropriate methods that are affordable for them to incorporate. Developing nations also need to put these methods into action while working on family planning, establishing appropriate programs, and preserving their own resources. The following table on this slide and the next describes sustainability methods for the specific environmental categories of soil, fertilizer, livestock, herbicides and pesticides, water, and energy. Take a moment and review how low input sustainable methods can be used in place of high input unsustainable methods in an effort to produce enough food without damage to the environment. As we wrap up the chapter, we're going to take a look at the concept of ecological footprints, as well as the terms food or carbon footprints. We know that we need to produce food and decrease damage to the environment. The good news is that more consumers are getting on board with this necessary concept, with focusing on sustainability practices. Unfortunately, the United States as a whole has much work to do. Take a look at this representation of ecological footprints. The United Nations describes a nation's impact on the environment as its ecological footprint. This is a measure of the resources used to support a nation's consumption of food, materials, as well as energy. Based on this graph, North America includes the world's greatest consumers on a per capita basis. Although Asia's population is more than 10 times as great as North America, its consumption is only 1/6 as large, meaning that their footprints are actually similar. Continuing with the footprint concept, we can also look at how the selection of certain foods adds to our individual footprint. This graph depicts the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions from the production, processing, and transport of specific foods. What you'll notice is that the majority of foods with the lowest emissions, including carbon dioxide, are plant-based foods. Animal-based foods have a much greater food or carbon footprint. So what types of foods should we be selecting to keep our food footprint low? Well, in general, it's recommended that we eat low on the food chain. So what does that mean? It means to select more plant-based foods. Why? Plant-based foods use fewer natural resources and are less environmentally damaging than animal-based foods. In general, grains use the least amount of energy in their production. Fruits and vegetables use more energy to produce than grains, but it's still considerably less compared to animal or animal-based foods. As far as the animal-derived or animal-based foods, if at all possible, if you can select range or grass-fed cuts of meat, and this is from cattle that is not fed commercial feed. Reason being is that these types of cattle that are raised on the open range, they require about as much energy as most plant-based foods in general, so they're going to be better choices. Just simply consuming smaller portions of animal-based foods can reduce our food footprint, as well as making sure that the fish that we are consuming is coming from sustainable sources. You can see how different food choices do have an effect on the environment from this particular visual. The amount of energy or fuel needed to produce animal products is substantially more than plant products. We can see that plant-based foods can have a positive effect on the environment, but we can even go one step further and choose more locally grown foods. It's estimated that on average, an item of food is transported 1,500 miles before it is eaten, even when the crops are grown and the final destination are both in the United States. Think about the effects from emissions alone in the transportation of foods. Buying locally grown products supports a global environment, but it also can support small farmers who otherwise couldn't compete economically with mass producers. As another positive note, it's been determined that families who buy local produce tend to eat a greater amount, which in turn supports a healthy lifestyle. What else can we do to help conserve our resources, protect our environment, and ultimately reduce our overall footprint? Highlight 20 at the end of the chapter has a multitude of suggestions, including some which are listed here. We need to keep in mind that even small steps we take as consumers can have a substantial influence on food security for our ever-increasing world population.